Consider the possibility that your knowledge of Sherman's march on Atlanta was incomplete. A story of bold bets, acrimonious rivalries, and last-ditch choices that influenced the destiny of a split country may be found beyond the well-known conflicts and tactical events. This is not only a tale of Confederate resistance or Union conquest, rather it is a high-stakes chess game in which each move could mean the difference between success and defeat. The hidden facets of Sherman's campaign that history books sometimes ignore will be revealed, from daring gambits and covert plots to crushing defeats and unexpected turns. Join us as we uncover the details of Sherman's march to Atlanta that history has left out. Since reality is more compelling than fantasy, please support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel before we start. The Confederacy was having trouble staying afloat by the end of 1863. After a string of Union victories, like as Ulysses S. Grant's historic victory at Chattanooga and their abortive assault of the North at Gettysburg, their hopes and morale had been dashed. Because of this victory, the Union was able to take over Tennessee, dividing the Confederacy in two and severely undermining their war effort. In the meantime, the Northern economy was booming, and the Union's military operations were perceived as making progress, despite obstacles like inflation and a lack of workers. Union General William T. Sherman thought that the war could be ended in 1864 with a strong campaign in Confederate territory. By April, Ulysses S. Grant had given him orders to seize Atlanta, a city vital to the Confederate supply line and overarching plan. Sherman and his soldiers entered Georgia on May 7th and started moving toward the Confederate soldiers positioned at Rocky Face Ridge. General Joseph E. Johnston, who was well-liked and constantly successful, commanded these forces. In an attempt to cut off Johnston's supply line and obstruct his retreat, Sherman sent a Union force led by Major General James McPherson against Rosaka via Snake Creek Gap as his army drew closer to Rocky Face Ridge. On May 8th, while McPherson advanced on Rosaka, other Union forces clashed with Confederate forces near Buzzard's Roost and Rocky Face Ridge. When McPherson's force arrived in Rosaka on May 9th, they came with heavily defended Confederate positions. Sherman sent troops from the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio to Rosaka on May 10th in an effort to bolster McPherson's soldiers. After learning of Sherman's tactics while the action was still going on at Rocky Face Ridge, Johnston directed his forces toward Rosaka on May 12th. At the Battle of Rosaka, which took place on May 13th, Federal forces engaged Confederate troops in intense combat in the campaign's first significant engagement. Confederate cavalry attacked upon McPherson's arrival, but were ultimately driven back when Union forces took control of Bald Hill following fierce combat. But this triumph didn't last long. Sherman was deeply dissatisfied by McPherson's decision to withdraw his men to Snake Creek Gap, out of fear of a counterattack by Johnston's forces. Sherman reached Rosaka the following day and directed constant attacks to keep the Confederates fighting, while another division, led by Thomas W. Sweeney, attempted to take over the railroad by crossing the Oostenaula River. Johnston gave the order for his troops to withdraw overnight on May 15th after he realized Sweeney's forces had outflanked him. In an effort to demolish the bridges behind them, they crossed to the Oostenaula River's south bank. But Union forces immediately learned of their retreat, pursued them, and swiftly restored the broken bridges. Sherman and the Union Army continued to pursue Johnston's army until they arrived at Allatoona Pass on May 20th. Sherman sought to outmaneuver the Confederates by attacking their vulnerable left flank rather than attacking them directly. He intended to move the Cumberland Army in the direction of Dallas, Georgia. Johnston, however, had foreseen this tactic and had his forces positioned to obstruct the Federals near New Hope Church. On May 25th, Sherman gave Major General Joseph Hooker's men the command to strike because he misjudged the Confederate forces' strength. This choice proved to be a mistake. Hooker's soldiers were unable to penetrate the Confederates' well-prepared defenses and tough terrain. Sherman made the decision to leave by May 27th and turn his attention to the Confederate right flank. On May 27th, Sherman ordered a corps led by Major General Oliver Howard to advance toward the enemy's right flank in order to quickly carry out this new strategy. Howard's corps reached Pickett's Mill by that afternoon, where about 10,000 Confederate forces had taken up residence. Around 5 p.m., the battle broke out, and it raged ferociously into the night. After successfully fending off Union attacks on both flanks, the Confederates maintained their position and gained confidence as dawn broke the next day. The Confederates started their own offensive after this victory. Major General William G. Hardee's brigade moved toward Dallas, the location of Sherman's right flank. On May 28th, fighting broke out as both sides hurried reinforcements into the conflict, increasing the level of casualties and the intensity of the fighting. Even though the Confederates were ultimately forced to retreat, fighting continued for a few days in the Dallas area. Sherman made the decision to leave the Dallas region on June 1st and head back to the Western and Atlantic Railroad for supplies, still determined to outmaneuver Johnston. Johnston's main force had taken up a strong defensive position at Kennesaw Mountain, only 25 miles from Atlanta, on June 19th. The Confederate line was set out in a crescent shape and was well fortified. Its left wing stretched southward close to Cobb's Farm Plantation, while its right flank was positioned approximately north of Marietta. Their line's center passed through Kennesaw Mountain itself to the southwest. Sherman made the decision to take dramatic action on June 22nd, when weeks of nonstop rain suddenly gave way to bright skies. He gave the order for his troops to attack the Confederate left flank in an attempt to cut off the Confederate Army's vital supply route, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Lieutenant General John Bell Hood commanded the Confederate forces stationed at Cobb's Farm. As the Union forces got closer to Hood's position, Hood authorized an attack without first speaking to Johnston. Hood was unaware that the Union had apprehended a number of Confederate skirmishers who had warned of an impending attack. A bigger Union army of 14,000 soldiers waited as Hood's 11,000-man force pushed across swampy terrain. At 5 p.m., the combat started, but Hood's forces were soon outmaneuvered. Approximately 1,000 members of his soldiers were killed during the battle. The Union soldiers failed to advance toward Marietta or Atlanta in spite of this victory. Sherman made the decision to forego his usual flanking tactics and try a direct attack on the Confederate line since he had run out of other practical ways to penetrate the Confederate defenses. Sherman chose to launch a frontal attack for the first time throughout the war, and in order to preserve a sense of surprise, he gave his commanders orders to keep the plan a secret, even from his staff officers. Sherman came up with a plan that involved feints on both wings to distract Johnston while he was getting ready for a central attack, despite the dangers involved. He gave his commanders instructions to concentrate their primary emphasis on the center while simulating attacks on either side. Although Sherman was aware that this strategy might be expensive, he thought the chances of it succeeding were greater than those of trying another flanking move. According to the plan, Schofield's army would attack the Confederate left flank close to Ollie Creek, while McPherson's men would attack the Confederate right flank at Pigeon Hill and Little Kennesaw. Hardee's corps, which was positioned at Kennesaw Mountain, would be the target of a larger Union force at the same time. Sherman's forces attacked at dawn on June 27th. Confederate artillery successfully repelled Union troops advancing against their right flank, while Johnston's strongest division, led by Major General Patrick Cleburne, held firm against the central assault. Before moving their infantry, the Union launched a 15-minute artillery barrage, but the Confederate fortifications were too strong. Several Union commanders were killed in the frantic assault as their forces disintegrated, and by midday it was clear that Sherman's frontal assault had failed. Sherman was able to outflank Johnston's left flank on July 2nd nevertheless, which prompted yet another Confederate withdrawal and moved Union forces closer to Atlanta. Johnston's defensive tactics had so far been successful in holding off Sherman's advance, but his frequent withdrawals gave Union forces a perilously close approach to Atlanta. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was worried by these withdrawals and chose to replace Johnston with Hood, who was renowned for his combative methods, in the middle of July. Hood promptly began attacking Sherman's force, as was customary. However, Hood was eventually unable to stop Sherman's relentless drive toward Atlanta despite a number of intense encounters. When the Confederates learned of the Union's intentions to seize Atlanta earlier that year, they built 2 defensive fortifications surrounding the city, mainly using slave labor to finish the job. Hood made Atlanta and its defenses his main operational base after assuming Johnston's leadership. Hood left 2 corps behind to protect the city's inner defenses as he led his army out of Atlanta on the evening of July 21st and marched toward the Union forces. Hood destroyed the Union supply train with an attack aimed at the back of the lines, leaving them trapped far into Confederate territory. Hood took over Johnston's command and established Atlanta and its defenses as his primary operations headquarters. On the evening of July 21st, Hood led his army out of Atlanta and marched toward the Union forces, leaving two corps behind to guard the city's inner defenses. Hood's attack on the rear of the lines destroyed the Union supply train, trapping them deep within Confederate territory. Sherman was informed just before sunrise on July 22nd that Hood's troops had left Atlanta's protective ring. After hearing McPherson's suggestion and learning that Confederate soldiers were still in control of Atlanta, Sherman changed his mind about pursuing Hood's army. Sherman instead decided to remain in his role. McPherson organized his 35,000 soldiers in an L-shaped configuration, built trenches to fortify the line, and placed a cannon on Bald Hill in anticipation of an impending attack. Hood led his men over difficult terrain in an effort to surprise the Union from behind, unaware of McPherson's defensive preparations. Hood's infantry, however, arrived at their positions 6 hours later than anticipated due to delays. They ended up south of the Union's well-established left flank rather than behind it because they lacked precise knowledge on McPherson's whereabouts. Hood's soldiers engaged the Union line at around noon. McPherson personally rode out to examine a weak spot where two parts of his line connected as the Confederate attack grew more intense. Confederate soldiers saw him doing this and shot him off his horse. McPherson passed away soon after. Union forces held their ground against Hood's attack despite losing their general at this crucial juncture. Bald Hill was passed by the Confederates. The conflict lasted until dusk, at which point Hood was forced to return to Atlanta. During the battle, the Union lost both troops and ground, but they were able to prevent the destruction of their wagon train. Hood's assault had finally been unsuccessful. Sherman started his campaign to isolate Atlanta again on July 27th. Skirmishes broke out all around Atlanta during the summer as both factions fought for control. However, Atlanta was still governed by the Confederacy by the end of August. Confederate infrastructure was somewhat damaged by Union cavalry attacks, but Hood's men were still supported by a number of essential supply routes. Sherman came up with a plan to drive the Confederates out of Atlanta after realizing that a direct attack would not be sufficient to capture the city. Sherman concluded that Hood's supply chain would be severely disrupted and an evacuation would be required if two important railroads, the Macon and Western and the Atlanta and West Point lines, which are situated south of Atlanta, were destroyed. In late August, Hood sent two corps under Hardee to stop Union forces as they reached the railroad close to Jonesboro. But when Hardee's forces engaged on August 31st, they were decisively defeated. Hood called one corps back to defend Atlanta that evening, out of fear of a full-scale Union attack on the city itself. Union forces decisively breached Hardee's line on September 1st. Hood issued an order for Atlanta to be evacuated since there was no other choice. On September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta was turned up to Union forces the next day. Sherman had at last accomplished his goal. Sherman's triumph was celebrated as a watershed in the Civil War and a crushing blow to the Confederacy when the dust settled over Atlanta. Was it, however, a true strategic victory or a sign of something more sinister? The campaign left a city in ruins, families uprooted, and a track of burnt ground in its wake. Sherman's march might have accelerated the war's conclusion, but at what price? Though they hardly ever ask, historians frequently praise his genius. Was America's moral compass permanently altered by Sherman's brand of total war? Did his merciless effectiveness create a precedent for the unbridled killing of civilians in conflict, or was it a necessary evil? And now for the actual query. What facts concerning Sherman's march have been lost to time if the winners write history? Share your thoughts with us. Did Sherman destroy something far better, or did he save the Union?